My father, years ago, when I was a kid, during the late years of the civil rights movement, he had a way of arguing sometimes if he thought the circumstances were right. He would say to somebody, been around a long time, I've known a lot of people, and I could tell something about you. I could tell something about you. Deep down, and then he would fill in some useful and valuable trait. Deep down, you judge a man by how he takes care of his family, not by the color of his skin. Or, deep down, you don't want to prevent my kids from swimming in a local swimming pool. Swimming pools were the last bastion of exclusion, believe me. But he would attribute to the person he was talking to some trait or capacity. Having drawn on his experience with people, good and bad, he would locate in someone the seed of something good with which he could work. He would identify that explicitly, nurture that, and say, that's how I knew I could talk to you. Because deep down, you ain't like that. We can't all be like my father. I can't be like my father. I wish I could. But we can learn something. We can learn something about the possibility of making arguments that not only don't debase each other, but arguably elevate. And that's what we're going to talk about in this, the last episode of this series. Now, my dad sometimes would be explicit in identifying a trait or capacity that he wanted to nurture and appeal to. That's not always possible or effective. Sometimes often that could be heavy-handed or come off as inappropriate, intrusive. So we're not always or even often going to be able to do that. Now, sometimes as a teacher, I can do that. If a student displays a particular intellectual trait, I can sometimes, without unduly embarrassing them, credit and identify that trait for their benefit and the benefit of their classmates. So sometimes you can be explicit, but there are other ways to identify, appeal to, and thus nurture positive traits. And what I'm asking in this last episode, and really asking is the right word because it's difficult, and I still have not quite figured out how to do it and how often it's possible. But what I'm asking is that when you have to persuade someone, you look for something in them to which you can appeal. That when you nurture it by appealing to it, it's good for them and good for us. Look for that. Now, that's actually useful to go all the way back to an earlier episode. Because if you are looking for something good or useful in the eudaimonistic sense, remember, we're talking about thriving. I'm not trying to be a moral philosopher. If you see a trait in someone that you think is a good trait for a human being to have, and can identify that, if you're looking for that, that is likely to help you understand them as they see themselves a little better than you otherwise would. So just diagnostically, it's helpful. Look for good and useful traits. And if you find them, think about whether you can persuade by appealing to them. It's not always possible. And sometimes you have to do it indirectly. I don't mean manipulate or trick. I mean you appeal to something just by the way you speak to them or by the arguments you make. For example, if you want to appeal to someone's public spiritedness, or to their, closely related, their desire to understand themselves as public spirited, right? Which is not exactly the same thing, but remember, not every aspiration is hypocrisy. Okay, a person can honestly aspire to understand themselves as public spirited, even though sometimes they fall short. Okay? So don't dismiss their aspiration as hypocrisy just because they fall short. If you see in someone an aspiration to be or understand themselves as public spirited, then you can appeal to that. You don't have to say, I could tell someone about you, you're public spirited. That probably won't work. But what you can do is simply appeal to their public spirit. You could even say, people like us who have concern for the public well-being, we recognize X, Y, and Z, or knowing that you recognize the value of the public, you can indirectly nurture it simply by appealing to it. You don't have to talk about traits and capacities. You don't have to do Aristotelian virtue ethics. Just choose your arguments by, in part, if you can, by the fact that they appeal to particular traits. Fairness is another one. People want to understand themselves as fair-minded. And all of us are somewhere along the line to fair-minded and somewhere along the line to, as my daughter used to say about referees she didn't like, sided. But people want to see themselves as fair. So if you can attribute that to someone, right, indirectly or directly, appeal to their desire to be and be perceived as fair-minded. Again, the fact that part of it is a desire to understand themselves or be perceived as fair does not make that aspiration pure hypocrisy. If they have no desire actually to be fair or public-spirited, and it's pure hypocritical display on their part, then it won't work to appeal to that. But for many people, it's much more complicated than that. Okay? Aspiration is a part of who we are. Bravery. People want to understand themselves as brave. And so you could say, people like you and I, we're not afraid of that. Or I know that you're not afraid of this, that, and the other. You can attribute the trait and then appeal to it in your arguments. Bravery. As I mentioned my daughter in her athletic history. I remember one time a coach, she had a teammate used to always get hurt. You know how you got sometimes a teammate always got a sprained ankle, always whining. And the coach waited for this particular kid, my daughter's teammate, to get back up after falling. And then the coach said, that's what I like about you. Deep down, you're a gamer. People don't know that, but deep down, you're tough. Well, that became a part of the kid's perception. Now, of course, the impact that a coach has on a young athlete is larger than the impact we might have on people we argue. But the point is, by appealing to and attributing that trait, that coach was able to nurture it in that kid, much to the kid's benefit, and probably to the benefit of the team in the meantime, right? People want to understand themselves and to some extent want to be environmentally responsible. That's why I don't hate on the companies that try to market the environmental responsibility of their products. Yes, I know sometimes the products aren't really as environmentally friendly as the marketers try to claim, and that's a different kind of problem. But the appeal to that is a good thing, because what are they doing? They're nurturing something good and useful by appealing. They say, I know that you want to be environmentally responsible, so you should buy my overpriced jacket instead of their overpriced jacket. Well, whether or not you need the jacket, it's probably good to nurture in you that positive trait. I mentioned in the last episode that one problematic trait that arguments sometimes nurture is an inability to deal with complexity. Well, you can nurture the opposite by saying, look, I know you of all people can understand how these things work. They aren't that straightforward, right? Because I know you've been around a little bit, and you know, on one hand, you can attribute to them by the way you argue the capacity to which you want to appeal, and then arguably nurture that capacity. Don't always try to figure out how to tell people that they're wrong and bad. Sometimes try to figure out, help people see how they can be right and good. help people, if you can, marginally, incrementally, craft a worldview that works. How do you do that? You say, that's not my job, craft a worldview. I'm telling you, if you're persuading them, then you're doing it. That's the point of all the other episodes. Don't wash your hands of that responsibility. If you are persuading people, you are in the worldview building business. The only question is whether you're helping them construct a worldview that's good for them and us or bad for them and us. Okay? You're doing it. Sometimes people act like lying and coercion are the only problematic things about an argument. This whole second half of this little series here has been a counter to that. Yes, don't lie, don't coerce, but also think about the fact that when you persuade, you're in the worldview building business. You're in the Weltanschauung construction industry. And are you going to build a worldview that's debasing and harmful to them, or are you going to build a worldview that elevates them? And you know, as I said in one of these episodes, one good thing about empathetic engagement is that it helps you see the world and yourself better. Okay, I think that was episode 3. Okay, but this does too. In other words, trying to find the positive traits in people develops in you an eye for good traits. It really does. It develops in you the capacity to recognize and nurture traits that are good for people's thriving. It's not unrelated that my dad was able to become a good man himself and to help raise some decent sons, I hope, knock on wood, that he would also communicate with other people in this way, because my dad was in the business of finding and nurturing the better angels of our nature in himself and in those with whom he dealt. That's what I want us to try to emulate to the extent that we can. You know, you probably already know, you're onto this, but I've tried to do that here. Okay, I've tried to persuade you to think about some things, right? You notice what I haven't done. I haven't said, oh, you'll get rich. If you listen to me and become an expert persuader, you'll get rich or you'll advance in your career. I haven't done that. Why? Because I think you're better than that. I've attributed to you what I know you have, which is the capacity to aspire to something better, to have an ethical component to your persuasive power, right? That's what I've tried to do. I also haven't dumbed down all my arguments and tried to put them in some kind of cynical form, because I've attributed to you, I believe that you have the capacity to aspire to the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Now, how do I know that, given that I don't know you? You say, well, how do I claim to know that you have the capacity? I'll tell you why. This I learned from my grandfather. Meanwhile, I'm telling you about everybody in my family. Might as well tell you about my grandfather. He was coal miner and union worker in the Depression in West Virginia. He had to deal with a lot of different kind of people, not all of them sweethearts, believe me, in some tough situations. And here's what my grandfather said, at least according to my father and my uncles. They said, my grandfather said this, and if he didn't say it, I'm saying it. Everybody wants to think of himself as a good man. Don't argue with them, hold them to it. Every man wants to think of himself as a good man. Don't argue with him, hold him to it. And I would add, and help him do it. Help him do it. Let's do that. Let's help each other through our efforts at persuasion, through our conversations and other interactions. Let's help each other be the people that we want to believe we are and that I believe we're capable of being. And the way in which most of us exercise the most power, although indirectly and cumulatively, rather than any particular dramatic moment, is through the way we speak to each other, through the way we talk, through the way we argue. So let's learn, if we can, to do it better. Thank you.